There are stories that arrive like a chill. A morning so ordinary it tastes of bread and smoke, and then, without warning, a presence settles like dust into the corners of a house, knocking at night, whispering in the dark, answering questions no one dared to ask. Some hauntings fade like a bad dream. Others hang on, stubborn as ivy, growing into legend that will not be scrubbed away. This is one of those legends, the Bell Witch. It began at a solitary farm on the Red River in Tennessee in the years after the War of 1812, and it did not end when one man closed his eyes for the last time. It spread outward, drawing neighbors, magistrates, and incredulous travelers, until the story of a family besieged by a malicious intelligence became America's most infamous poltergeist tale, and a question that keeps returning. What really happened at the Bell Farm, and why do the whispers from that place refuse to die? On a slope of dark loam, a modest log house stood above a bend in the Red River, shielded by maples and walnut trees. The owner, John Bell, was a prosperous settler by frontier standards, farmer, patriarch, veteran. He and his wife Lucy had raised a family of 6 children and carved a life out of stubborn earth. Their nearest neighbors lived within hours' travel. The county seat lay further still. Life here was work and weather and prayer. Safety was measured in fences and firearms. It was in this ordinary pocket of the American frontier that, beginning around 1817, the Bell family first reported unexplained knockings on the walls and the roof. At first they were small, faint raps in the night like wind-stirred limbs, easily explained by animals or frost. But they grew bolder. They answered questions in distinct voices. They moved objects. They slapped and pinched. They spoke directly to members of the household. And then, most unnervingly of all, they spoke of names and secrets no one in the family expected to be known. The phenomenon followed no polite schedule. It woke the household at odd hours and joined the family at the dinner table. It tested the limits of belief by alternately cruel and mischievous actions. Silverware tossed, beds shaken, blankets pulled from sleeping bodies. It addressed people by name, pronounced prophecies, and more than once, removed the balance from a man whose pride had been plain to everyone around him. The family's accounts, passed down, written and rewritten through the years, describe a presence that relished attention and seemed to feed on the fear it produced. Among the Bells, one figure stood at the center of the story: Betsy. As a young woman on the threshold of marriage, Betsy Bell became the focus of the entity's outward malice. Her hair was tugged, her face slapped, and her skirts were yanked in the middle of the night. The voice that spoke to the family often took on a tone of cruel intimacy when addressing her, mocking engagements and promising to ruin marriages, which it did, according to contemporary retellings. Betsy's claims were not solitary. Servants and children corroborated similar attacks. What began as scratching and tapping became targeted, sustained harassment that seemed fixated upon a single household member. Neighbors and visitors quickly found themselves drawn into the drama. Word traveled, as it does in small communities, and skepticism met curiosity. Some men came with loaded muskets to stand guard at night. Others came with laughter and wagers, convinced that the events were a prank or an episode of mass hysteria. Many left unsettled. A local magistrate sent a delegation to investigate. They reported having heard the sounds themselves and, in some accounts, felt the force of the entity's presence. As the disturbances escalated, accusations followed in predictable patterns. In later retellings, the spirit was identified as Kate, a bitter woman who had cursed the Bells after an altercation. This identification fits a human need for cause. Give the uncanny a face, and the story becomes easier to bear. Yet historians caution against leaping from neighborly dispute to supernatural verdict. Records from the era are sparse. What survives are threads, oral recollections, court notes, and long late pamphlets that were braided over decades into a single voice. The question of motive, if the events were natural, is thorny. If the phenomena were the product of a human mind, why the particular focus? Why Betsy? Why the timing? At the heart of the legend sits one of the most combustible claims, that John Bell himself was poisoned, and by the very spirit that tormented his household. According to the most dramatic versions of the tale, the presence began as mischief and then turned lethal, feeding hatred into a gauntlet of symptoms that culminated in the patriarch's death in December of 1820. John fell ill for weeks. Stomach pains, vomiting, weakness that deepened into prostration. The family doctor could do little. The community watched as a sturdy man dwindled away. Whether the cause of death was homicidal poisoning, natural disease, or psychosomatic collapse remains a matter of debate. Contemporary medicine was crude. Notions of contagion and toxicity were limited. A determined era's moral imagination found poetry in the narrative of a man undone by a supernatural enemy. Those who wished to believe a witch had poisoned John found their story ready-made. Those who questioned the supernatural still had to confront an uncomfortable social reality. Grief and rumor can be as destructive as any toxin. Beyond grief came public curiosity. Visitors arrived in steady trickles. Curious farmers, traveling ministers, and, according to some sensational accounts, figures of higher station. Some reports over time claimed that Andrew Jackson himself had visited the Bells and proved courageous when the spirit tried to vex him. Others attributed a visit to future President Martin Van Buren. Those embellishments, persistent though they are in folklore, lack reliable documentary support. What is better attested is the arrival of people from surrounding counties who wished to witness the phenomena and, if possible, to be rid of whatever it was that haunted the Bell homestead. The experience, as recorded, was not consistent with simple mischief. It was theatrical. The voice conversed with visitors and engaged them in argument. It could be witty and crude in the same breath, insulting the piety of ministers and the courage of hunters. It recited scripture with mocking inflection and could mimic human speech with unnerving accuracy. In some renditions, the voice sang long ballads, begged for food, or answered riddles posed by skeptics. It seemed to relish an audience and fed off the attention it provoked. When those who mocked it threatened violence, the activity reportedly intensified, as if provoked by the challenge. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Bell phenomenon is how it blurred the boundary between physical and verbal attack. Witnesses described not only the scratch of nails in the night, but physical blows, slaps and pinches so convincing that marks were left on skin. Objects moved of their own accord. Animals in the household were said to be impacted. Dogs that would not enter certain rooms, and hens that refused to lay eggs. Once, according to some versions, the presence spoke through a young child, a voice that was not the child's, delivering messages and predictions that chilled those who heard them. The debate over the Bell Witch rapidly split into factions: believers, scoffers, and the pragmatic locals who simply wanted quiet. Believers gathered testimony and preserved trinkets and signed affidavits. Skeptics toured the site, trying to catch tricksters in the act. Several attempts were made to subject the phenomena to test, by inviting strangers to stay overnight, by attempting to record or replicate knocks, by staging challenges. The results only added fuel to the fire. When Knox answered skeptics but not others, disciples called it proof of selectivity. When a skeptic claimed the entire thing a fraud, believers said he spoke only because the entity permitted it. In the years that followed, the tale made the leap from local gossip to published legend. The earliest substantial printed account that boosted the story's reach appeared decades later, as part of a trend in the 19th century to collect local wonder tales into pamphlets and volumes. Those works, often authored by well-meaning compilers, mixed interviews, parish notes, and second-hand reminiscences with a modern flair for drama. Martin V. Ingram's 1894 compilation, one of the most famous, presented the Bell Witch narrative in vivid, sustained form and helped cement the haunting's place in American folklore. Yet scholars note that the gap between the events and Ingram's book allowed for embellishment to creep in. Names shifted, episodes grew theatrical, and the voice of the witch matured into a vivid, often obscene character that sold papers as much as it terrified readers. Such retellings beg a careful approach. When the archive is thin, legend can expand to fill the dark. That is not to say all eyewitnesses lied or were mad. Rather, memory is porous. Trauma magnifies small occurrences. Rumor fills gaps with invention. Oral culture preserves stories that speak to communal anxieties, fear of the outsider, the fragility of frontier life, and the dread that nature holds moral agency. In the Bell Witch mythology, these anxieties take corporeal form. A local grievance becomes a haunting that unsettles the social order. Differing scholarly explanations for the Bell events hover between psychology and sociology. Some suggest poltergeist dynamics, today understood as psychokinetic phenomena often centered on an emotionally distressed individual, may account for knocks, moving objects, and selective aggression. This explanation often points to the stressors of frontier life, poverty, isolation, and the generational tensions within families. Others argue mass psychogenic illness better explains the spread of testimonies. In small communities with tightly woven belief networks, a set of suggestive incidents can cascade into a self-reinforcing narrative of supernatural attack. Another possibility is plain human deception, either malicious pranking or elaborate schemes to exploit gossip for social advantage. The rural world of the early 19th century contained tensions over land, honor, and gender. A hostile neighbor could weaponize rumor. Yet the details of the Bell Witch case, reports of multiple independent witnesses, of physical marks, of visitors interrogated by the voice, make pure fraud less tidy as an explanation, though it cannot be entirely ruled out. Modern researchers also remind us about cultural framing. In a time when belief in witches and spirits had not vanished from American life, even minor misfortunes were often read through a supernatural lens. An unexplained illness, a drought, a family feud, each could become evidence of malice from beyond. In that context, the Bell Witch story is not anomalous. It is an extended, dramatic expression of cultural possibility. Physical traces of the Bell story survive in place. The Bell Witch Cave, a limestone hollow on the property that later proprietors linked to the phenomena, became a shrine and attraction. Tourists, paranormal investigators, and the merely curious have visited for generations, bringing their own gadgets and expectations. Geiger counters, audio recorders, EMF meters, hoping to capture something the townsfolk once described in breath and shadow. The cave's association is more folkloric than empirical. Legends attach easily to geological features, which in turn amplify the story's theatrical reach. In the long arc of American culture, the Bell Witch's legacy is both dark and oddly productive. It generated cautionary tales, fueled pulp fiction, inspired films, and offered a template for how poltergeist stories could be framed in a distinctly American setting: frontier, family, and the uneasy edge of civilization. It also became a local economic engine. Storytellers, museum curators, and innkeepers capitalized on the tale, drawing visitors to Adams, Tennessee, the place where the story lodged itself in the soil. As with many long-lived legends, the Bell Witch resists neat endings. Skeptics catalog inconsistencies, folklorists trace the story's permutations, psychologists map its social vectors. For believers, testimony and the accumulation of stories are themselves evidentiary. For those who seek something in between, the tale offers a case study in how communities make meaning out of misfortune. There is no single answer that satisfies every frame of inquiry. Perhaps the most enduring question the story presses upon the listener is not whether a witch walked the Bell floors, but why the story was preserved so insistently. A haunting is not only about a house at night, it is about the human hunger to narrate suffering, to externalize blame, and to find agents, human or otherwise, on whom to hang the unexplainable. The Bell Witch is a mirror held up to the anxieties of a young nation. Fears about disease, about the unknown frontier, about the fragility of patriarchal authority. In that sense, the witch is as much a social symptom as a spectral antagonist. So the ridge above the Red River remains, seasons layering over one another. A small stone or plaque may mark the place where a log house once stood. The maples keep their silence. Visitors still stand beneath the trees at dusk and listen for knocks that do not arrive. Some come with a torch and a recorder, hoping to file away a beep or a click. Others come to taste the shadow of an old story, to put their hand against the wood where Betsy once said a voice had felt like a real hot breath. If the question is whether the Bell Witch was flesh or phantom, a neat verdict is impossible. What can be said with certainty is this: an event made of knocks, words, and pain took shape in a small Tennessee community in the early 19th century. It was witnessed, retold, revised, and finally written into the nation's ledger of the uncanny. It is a story stitched from the raw material of human life: grief, neighbor quarrels, mortality, and from the cultural frames that give those things shape. Perhaps the most unsettling thought of all: is that the Bell Witch's power lies in persistence. A ghost is only as potent as the stories that keep it alive. And those stories have a life of their own. They move between generations like a current, sometimes faint, sometimes strong, always ready to catch a listener on a long, dark night and pull them into a world where a knock on the wall might be the beginning of something that will not be explained away. When the night comes down on the scrubby hills and the Red River glints like a blade, that is when the tale of the Bell Witch still speaks its loudest. Not because the voice is heard, but because people still listen, and the act of listening draws the past toward the present. Whether the witch was devil or neighbor, prank or psychology, the story endures because it answers a deeper human hunger, the need to name the terrifying, to place it and to survive it, if only by telling the tale again.